Hello and welcome to this joint Euronews-EuroparlTV debate in which four guests discuss a topic of vital importance and considerable public interest in front of a studio audience, some of whom are going to be putting questions to our panel. Our subject today is climate change, the failure at Copenhagen and the upcoming conference in Cancun, Mexico, about which nobody seems very hopeful.
We'll put these topics to our four panelists here. Connie Hedegaard, European Commissioner for Climate Action, asked about Cancun. She says she's not too optimistic. With her in the studio, three MEPs, Corien Wortmann-Kool for the European People's Party, who chairs a working group on environment and economy. Satu Hassi for the Greens, who quit as Finnish Environment Minister over the construction of a fifth nuclear plant in her country. And last but not least, Roger Helmer from the European Conservatives and Reformists, who's both eurosceptic and climate skeptic, if I may say. He doesn't believe in man-made climate change.
We have one more guest too. He's Mohammed Al-Hadrami from the permanent mission of the Republic of Yemen to the United Nations, who's also, because Yemen currently holds the rotating presidency, chair of the Group of 77 and China. Now, he's listening to our debate on the telephone all the way from New York, and he'll be joining us during the course of today's programme.
Let's start with you, Connie Hedegaard. As Danish minister, you hosted the climate summit last year in Copenhagen. Looking back, COP15 is remembered as a huge disappointment. You obviously failed to get the parties to agree on a binding deal on greenhouse gases emission cuts. So what went wrong?
I think that the will was not there. The parties did not want to make the compromises necessary. I mean, that was basically what went wrong. Having said that, though, I think that we should also sort of acknowledge that actually a lot of things were achieved, and that's what we're trying to build upon now for Mexico. And also don't forget that in the run-up to Copenhagen, many countries in the world who earlier never set domestic targets, set targets because they knew their leaders would face the world public opinion in Copenhagen.
Some people are saying that what we need is a change of politics. In a sense, if you gather so many nations around a table to discuss an issue like this, you end up with lowest common denominator results. You end up with the least results that everyone can actually agree to. And it might be better to, for instance, spearhead the thing with, say, the EU, the US, Russia, India and China sitting around a table and discussing it separately. I mean, Corien Wortmann-Kool, what do you think about that? Should we change the politics here?
Well, I think we definitely have to change the strategy, because that is what we have to learn from the Copenhagen failure. And we also have to learn from what we achieved. And that is what our commissioner said, that there are certain initiatives who are really working in the right direction. There are certain sectors who are very active in meeting the objectives of climate change.
Roger Helmer, you're going to Cancun. I mean, presumably you're not expecting there to be any sort of breakthrough there. I mean, you don't actually believe that climate change is man-made anyway, do you?
No, I think the prospects for Cancun are clearly worse than those for Copenhagen. I think one of the problems is here, we're sitting in the Brussels bubble and thinking our own thoughts and airing our own prejudices, and we've got to engage with the real world. Developing nations like India and China are not going to give up on development in order to meet Western targets. America now has a new Republican House of Representatives. They are not going to pass any far-reaching emissions controls. So it's not going to happen. And if we in Europe proceed with our 20% or 30% or 50% or whatever the latest number is we pulled out of the air, we are taking all the pain and we are getting none of the gain, because whatever we do, the future of energy, the future of economies is in the East, is in India and China, and they are going to be powered by nuclear and coal. That is what's going to happen.
Maybe we could bring in Mohammed Al-Hadrami at this stage. What's your stand on that, Mr. Hadrami? Should the fight against climate change take place on several smaller fronts, like the rich countries front and the emerging countries one? Some blame you for the failure of the talks in Copenhagen. Some say you weren't prepared to share enough of the burden.
I believe, just to explain a bit, the G77 in China is a very large group. We are 131 countries. We have countries like China in one end, and we have countries like the Maldives. They're different. They have different views on climate change, but they're equally important to the group. having said that, in Copenhagen, I think the problem was in trust and procedure. And that really led to perhaps the failure in Copenhagen. It wasn't the G77 to blame for that failure. I think if we need to learn something from Copenhagen, is that not to repeat it again. And I think we should, all of us, look very hopefully with full hope and determination for Cancun, not to repeat Copenhagen and also to save our planet.
Satu Hassi, I mean, do we need to make these deals far more legally binding than they are? Because countries seem to feel free to wriggle out of them whatever they choose.
What is seems to be confusing for many people is that there is a legally binding emission reduction target only for industrialized countries, not for developing countries, for the simple reason that already in Rio in '92 it was agreed that industrialized countries who basically have started this mess, the climate change, and who can afford to start the measures, they take the first step, and Kyoto was meant to be the first step. Now we need the next step.
Okay. So maybe we'll turn to our audience now for a question from Joris den Blanken. You are the EU Climate Director for Greenpeace. Please.
Yes, thank you. It's maybe not very well known, but the EU, in fact, is very close already to meeting its carbon target for 2020. We have a vast amount of time, 10 years, to do 3% more emission reductions. And that sounds maybe great, but the risk is, of course, that the EU will really slow down and lose out on new green jobs, on new investments, on exports. And what does a panel think that we should do in the EU to stop that and to keep the EU's green crown?
Commissioner Hedegaard, I think it's a question for you.
Yeah,
first.
That's exactly in line with what our thinking is in the Commission, because what we presented back in May was to say, yes, there is one thing where it's linked to the international negotiations and what do everybody else do. But it's also in Europe's own interest to be ambitious in this field. And there I must say I disagree very much with Mr. Helmer. I think you would be disappointed if I did not. But I disagree very much that it's not about who's going to bear the cost and the suffering. I think all bigger economies of the world will have to pursue in the future a much more sustainable green kind of growth than the one we had when we built our wells in Europe and in other places of the world. And, you know, yes, there is this paradox that some parties are moving very slow around the negotiation table, but some of the same parties are moving very quickly in reality. Take, for instance, what they are doing in China, what they are doing in Korea. I mentioned a lot of countries before.
I can see Roger Helmer is definitely not agreeing with you there, Commissioner.
Well, the Commissioner tells us to consider what's happening in China, and that is excellent advice. What's happening in China is they're building a new coal-fired power station every week, with India not far behind. They are going ahead with coal, and their emissions will increase. Now, the questioner points out that we're within 3% of our European target, only, I have to say, because we're going through the mother and father of all recessions. And he asks about jobs and investment. The fact is that by imposing punitive policies and very high costs on European economies and European industry, we are driving jobs and investment and business offshore to jurisdictions with lower standards. So the effect will be that we will ramp up unemployment in Europe, but actually the environment will get the worst deal because we will go to places with lower standards.
That is the effect of much wants to European... react to your position.
Yeah, well, it's a fact that China is increasing their emissions, but they are moving even more rapidly in the field of new energy technologies. Last year, they became the biggest investor in wind power in the world. For several years, they have every year doubled the wind power capacity. In all industrial changes and market changes, finally those ones who are among the first movers, they are the ones who benefit. How can you stay competitive
by doubling your electricity costs and forcing people into fuel poverty?
No, but can I just add one thing? It seems as if you, Mr. Helmer, thinks that we can only lose jobs in Europe if we are ambitious. No, we can also lose jobs if we are dragging our feet.
Yeah,
what we
true.
are faced with is how to find exactly the right balance to be ambitious, but not be over-ambitious. That is what the political challenge here is all about, not just to come with a lot of claims that simply is not true.
The Spanish experience was that every green job created cost 2.2 jobs in the real economy because the high costs of green energy depressed economic growth overall.
I must just say it's not true. I come from a country where from nothing In 20 years, we today have 20% of exports in the field of renewables and energy efficient products. So it's an example that you can actually improve your economy if you do this in an intelligent way.
It's clear that Mr. Helmer is much too defensive because we have a lot to gain on sustainable technologies. However, moving unilaterally to the 30% target, I'm very much against, because when we really want to fight climate change, we have to challenge also the United States, Japan, China, also to commit to binding targets. And as long as they don't do that, we should stick to the 20%. But that doesn't mean that we should lean back and do nothing.
In a moment, we'll be looking at what can be achieved in Cancun. Not much, according to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon himself. Join us after the news.